Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, sir.
Today, we are sitting here for a course in classic English essays. You probably have heard about the word, but the word essay derives itself from the French word, the French infinitive, essayer. The French infinitive essayer means to try, to attempt to do something. The Frenchman Michel de Montaigne was probably the first author to describe his work as essays. He used the word initially to characterize these as some attempts to put his interesting thoughts in writing. He was the first man to do this, and he began to compose his essays in the year of 1572. And the first edition of his essays came in 2 volumes, and they were published in 1580. Interestingly, Montaigne spent the entirety of his rest of his life in the revising of his earlier published essays and writing of new essays. In England, Francis Bacon was probably the first person to start writing essays proper. His essays was published in book form as early as 1597, although most of these essays were revised later, and the same volume of essays were later on expanded to include more. I will come back to that point later. By the word classical, we mean works generally acknowledged in and outside English literature as representing the best, the very best, that have been written and read in this genre in literary history. According to Aldous Huxley, the essay is a literary form or literary device for saying almost everything about just almost everything, usually on a certain topic. By definition, of course, the essay is short, so it is impossible to give all things full play within the limits of a single essay. But you know, an essay can be included in a book of essays. When many essays are included in the same volume, they make a big book. And when these essays come together, they can cover almost as much ground and cover it almost as thoroughly as a long, big novel. This course of classic English essays intends to examine 10 essays by 10 British authors, beginning with Francis Bacon. Other essays that we're going to examine in this course, it will include Joseph Addison, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Johnson, Charles Lamb, Matthew Arnold, Oscar Wilde, D.H. Lawrence, J.B. Priestley, and Virginia Woolf. Today we're going to begin with Francis Bacon. The essay by Francis Bacon that we're going to look at today is entitled Of Love. It was written 400 years ago, exactly. Before we take a look at the essay in itself, we are going to look at some of the highlights of Francis Bacon as a great man of Renaissance time. Francis Bacon was born in 1561 and died in 1626. He was born in London, in the metropolis. He later grew up to become a philosopher, a statesman, a scientist, a jurist, and a great author. The story of Francis Bacon was one of a great man, most talented, most ambitious, most aggressive, and most versatile. He was a contemporary of William Shakespeare, and he lived through 2 of the most important eras of English history, and they are, respectively, the Elizabethan era and the Jacobean eras. Now, many of you would find it difficult to understand. The Elizabethan era, the Jacobean era, if you're not familiar with those terms, you'll probably have to ask what they respectively mean. Does anyone know anything about this? I'd like someone to answer that question. Okay, Liu Weiqun, please. What do you know about the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras in English history? Yeah, Liu Weiqun.
The Elizabethan era was named after Queen Elizabeth I, who took throne in 1558, And the Jacobean era was named after King James I, who became the King of England in 1603. The two eras were very important because they both witnessed tremendous progress in almost every respect of England. Take literature for an example. There were famous writers such as John Milton, Christopher Marlowe, and most important of all, William Shakespeare, who was regarded as the most important playwright all time, and his tragedies, comedies, and sonnets are still being read, appreciated, and admired worldwide.
Thank you very much. Still performed, yes. Much of Shakespeare's plays still remains very popular and widely performed all around the world, including in China. Now, Francis Bacon was born in a recently distinguished family. His father was called Sir Nicholas Bacon, his mother, Anne Cook Bacon. When we talk about the distinction of Francis Bacon's life, we often refer to his mother's side, because his maternal grandfather was a famous humanist. His name was Anthony Cook, who once served as royal tutor to King Edward VI. And his mother's sister was later married to a man called William Cecil, also known as the first Baron Burghley, making the latter Francis Bacon's uncle. Francis Bacon later benefited significantly from this relationship with his uncle. Bacon was educated at home in his early years due to his poor health. Some people say poor health plagued the rest of his life. He had never enjoyed perfect good health later on. So in his early years, he had to stay at home and find someone to tutor him privately. He received his early tuition from a man called John Walsall, who was a graduate of Oxford University with a strong leaning towards Puritanism. Puritanism was a particular branch of Christian thought. At the time, it had enormous influence upon many people. And because of this relationship, Bacon came under the influence of Puritanism. And this is going to influence much of his thought later on. At the age of 12, he was able to enter Trinity College of Cambridge University. He lived there for 3 years with his older brother, Anthony Bacon, under the personal tutelage and assistance of a man called Dr. John Whitgift, who later on became the Archbishop of Canterbury. Bacon's education, for one reason or another, was conducted purely in Latin earlier, and later on he studied at the university following the medieval curriculum. So he had a very strong foundation in terms of education in Latin and the medieval curriculum. Bacon entered politics fairly early, if you look at it. In 1576, he went to Paris with the English ambassador and became a trainee diplomat. That was when he was about 15 or 16. He became a trainee diplomat, very young, and he entered politics. In the following decades, with the help of his uncle, as I earlier indicated, the first Baron Burghley, and with the help of his friends, Francis Bacon had an extremely successful political career. He was, for example, knighted in 1603 at the age of 42, very early, and he was appointed Attorney General at the age of 52 in 1613. At the age of 57, he became Lord Chancellor and the Baron Verulam in 1618. 3 years later, at the age of 30, he became Viscount St. Auburn. That's a lot of work, wasn't it? But Francis Bacon's achievements didn't stop with that. Nowadays, he is still remembered as the father of many things. We have a picture here. When the person who painted the portrait was told to say something about Francis Bacon, he actually said, "I wish I could paint what's inside this man's head." You can certainly paint a picture of a man, but can you paint something, paint a picture of the beauty of the inside of an intelligent young man. Francis Bacon achieved enormously in his lifetime and is today remembered as the father of modern jurisprudence, for example. As a lawyer, Francis Bacon's works influenced the idea of creating what is frequently referred to as the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon, you probably still know that word, you still remember that word. It's the name of a famous king of France. And the entire system of laws is often referred to as Napoleonic Code, which was a common law for the entirety of a country. You probably don't know, prior to a particular period of time, each locality in France had its own laws, which could be very different from many other areas. This made life confusing. So the most significant aspect of the Napoleonic Code is that it set uniform laws, similar laws, or identical laws for the entire country. People living in France could live under the same legal system, and that could be attributed to some of the thoughts initiated by Francis Bacon. He is also considered as the guiding spirit in the founding of the United States of America. As a statesman, he played a leading role in the creation of some of the British colonies in North America, one of which was the colony of Virginia. And he also helped to establish colonies in North Carolina and South Carolina. And in northeastern Canada, he helped to establish Newfoundland. You have a stamp on the right-hand side of my presentation. You see, this is a stamp which acknowledges his contribution to the establishment of Newfoundland in northeastern Canada. It was issued and published in 1910. It was intended to commemorate 300 years of history for the establishment and foundation of Newfoundland as a colony. Bacon is honored as the father of experimental science. He was a scientist. I'm going to tell you a story about it later on in relation to his death. As a scientist, Bacon's works established and popularized the inductive methodologies for scientific inquiry. Today, these methodologies are often called the Baconic method, or simply the scientific method. Inductive methodology is often opposed to what we call the deductive. Inductive stresses the importance of empiricism, the importance of accumulation of evidence. You draw a conclusion on the basis of an accumulation of sufficient examples. You have many examples, and then you can draw a conclusion about a phenomenon. You arrive at some kind of theoretical understanding of a thing because you have accumulated many evidences. And this is a purely empirical approach. Nowadays, this is considered as one of the most important scientific methods. Guess what Thomas Jefferson said about him? The third President of the United States and the writer, the author of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson once said, Bacon, Locke, and Newton, I consider these three people as the three greatest men that have ever lived, and I consider them as having laid the foundation of those superstructures which have been raised in the physical and moral sciences. That's an enormous praise for the work that was done by Francis Bacon. Now, Francis Bacon's end. On one hand, Francis Bacon's public career as a statesman ended in disgrace, very unfortunately. In 1621, in the same year when he became Viscount St. Auburn, a parliamentary committee decided to charge him with 23 different counts of corruption. And he was sentenced to a fine of £40,000 and put into prison in the Tower of London. Although he did manage to come out with the help of the king very soon, very quickly. And Bacon died a very dramatic death. He famously died by contracting pneumonia, which is a problem with the lungs. He died because he wanted to do a scientific experiment. In those days, people didn't have a fridge. People didn't know how to preserve food, you see. So he decided to work with a couple of other people to see if they can devise a scheme which can help preserve food. Chickens, for example, geese, ducks, once they're slaughtered. How do we preserve them for more than a few days? So he decided one day, it was on a snowy day, he decided to slaughter the fowl and take out the insides of the body and put some snow into it, and he carried the fowl while he was walking to a different place. And he probably carried the fowl with the snow inside the body of it for too long. And he got sick with a cold. And he eventually got pneumonia, and he died as a result. That was a dramatic death, wasn't it? He died as a result of a scientific experiment which he was trying to do in order to help mankind to devise new ways of keeping food so that they can last longer. So that was interesting. At his funeral, over 30 great people collected their eulogies of him. He was not only loved deeply, obviously, but much respected by great men like Ben Jonson. One biographer once said, Francis Bacon had such an enormous influence on every one of us that when we talk about Francis Bacon, we might say, every man who rides in a train today, sends a telegram, follows a steam plow, sits in an easy chair, crosses the Channel or the Atlantic, eats a good dinner, enjoys a beautiful garden, or undergoes a painless surgical operation, owes Francis Bacon something. That was almost everything. We owe Francis Bacon a debt. We owe Francis Bacon something for what he did during his lifetime. For almost everything that we are enjoying, we are benefiting from today. Now, Francis Bacon was an essayist. We still remember him as a great writer of essays. During his lifetime, he wrote profusely. He was a tireless and extremely prolific writer. Before his death, he published altogether something like 62 works. Among them, you would find things like the Essays, published in 1597, the Novum Organum, published only 3 years later, the New Atlantis, published in 1626. In the middle of the 19th century, one theory proposed, in fact, that probably Francis Bacon had written all the plays conventionally attributed to William Shakespeare. And we call that the famous Shakespearean debate. In the middle of the 19th century, there came this theory which proposed that maybe William Shakespeare never existed. If you look at the canon of Shakespeare, they were so incredibly good. You can't imagine anyone writing those things except Francis Bacon. But of course, the debate was soon over. Most of the people would still believe that William Shakespeare did in fact come up with this wonderful collection of works. About Francis Bacon's essays, as I indicated earlier, the first edition of his essays was published in 1596, but that volume of essays included only 10 essays, 10 pieces. In 1612, when a much enlarged, much expanded second edition was published, it included 20 more essays, over 20 more essays. In 1625, a third edition was published, and this time he had altogether 58 essays. He wrote so many of them. Each one of them was so good, so people can't help asking what exactly he did with those essays, what he wrote about in those essays. Francis Bacon said something about his own essays. He said, "My essays are but the recreation of my other studies." He probably never considered them as important as the things that he did with the science, for example, with the law, with jurisprudence, with other important issues of the world. The essays came as a side product. It was not that important after all. But in English literature, Bacon is often credited as having invented the essay form. Literary historians nowadays say Bacon's essays are much deeper and more discriminating than any earlier or almost any later work in the English language. So that's a great tribute paid to Francis Bacon. Now, what did Francis Bacon write about specifically in those 58 essays? I have put together some key words. I'll read them to you. Bacon wrote about ambition and anger. He wrote about beauty and building gardens. He wrote about ceremonies and cunning. He wrote about death and deformity. He wrote about envy, empire, and education. He wrote about fame, fortune, and friendship. He wrote about good and evil. He wrote about health and honor. He wrote about marriage and masks, nobility and negotiating, praise and prophecies, riches, revenge, and religion. He wrote about sedition, suspicions, and studies. He wrote about travel and truth, usury and vainglory, wisdom and youth. So that was a lot of work. He wrote profusely about all of these topics. You might want to know, what were some of the things that he said interestingly in those essays? I've deliberately chosen a few quotes from Francis Bacon, from Francis Bacon's essays. For example, about beauty, Bacon said, "Beauty is like summer fruits, which are easy to corrupt and cannot last." That's something highly philosophical. He said, beauty is not reliable. It's beautiful, but it doesn't last forever. What about friendship? He said, friendship redoubles joys. If you make a friend, your joy is redoubled. Everybody talks about that. That comes from Francis Bacon. And he said, friendship also cuts griefs into halves. I'm more interested in what Bacon said about fortune. We often talk about some people being more fortunate than others. We talk about good fortune and bad fortune. What did Francis Bacon say in terms of fortune? He said, the way of fortune is like the Milky Way in the sky. In contemporary English, we talk about the Milky Way. In those days, it was Milky Way in the sky, which is a meeting of a number of small stars. He said, fortune is like a Milky Way in which there is a collection and meeting of small stars, not seen asunder, not seen separately, in other words, but they give light together. The Milky Way is made up of multiple stars, a huge number of stars. They don't give light separately, but together they give enormous light. So are there a number of little and scarcely discerned virtues, or rather faculties and customs that make men fortunate? Do you understand what he's trying to say at the end of the quote? He said, fortune is like a Milky Way. It's a collection of many things. If you want a Milky Way to shine brilliantly, you need many ingredients, many elements. These elements are nothing but virtues, faculties, and customs. If you are a virtuous man, you are fortunate. If you are a man of abilities, you are going to be fortunate. If you observe the customs very well, you are likely to be a very fortunate person. That's very, very interesting. Now, we come to Francis Bacon's essay of love. As I said earlier, this essay was initially written and published in 1612, exactly 400 years ago. The essay went through some expansion and some revision in the year of 1625, when a third edition of Francis Bacon's essays were published. The essay is only about 620 words long. Not a terribly long piece, but it's got a relatively complete structure. It's made up of 3 parts. apart from the introduction in part 1 and the conclusion in part 3, you get a second part which focuses on some of the things that Francis Bacon really wanted to tell us about love as an experience in human lives. We'll begin with the introduction. In the opening paragraph of this essay, Francis Bacon said this: "The stage is more beholden to love than the life of man. For as to the stage, love is ever matter of comedies, and now and then of tragedies. But in life, it does much mischief, sometimes like a siren, sometimes like a fury. You may observe that almost all the great and worthy persons, whereof the memory remains, either ancient or recent, there is not one that has been transported to the mad degree of love, which shows great spirits and great business do keep out this weak passion." This is such a powerful introduction about love that you come to know about his views about love almost instantly. He said, the stage is more beholden to love than the life of man, which is another way of saying, if you want to talk about love, let's talk about love as it is represented in dramas on the stage. Please don't let us see it happening in the life of a man, because it tends to make mischief. It tends to make trouble in the life of a man. On the stage, you sometimes see tragedies about love. You sometimes see comedies. That's okay, because it's on the stage, it's all fictional. But when it happens to a real man, it can be dangerous. It can be mischievous. He said, love can sometimes work like a siren, can sometimes work like a fury. Siren and fury are famous mythical or mythological figures. In Greek mythology, the sirens were dangerous female creatures who were inclined to lure or tempt or seduce sailors with their music and voices. The sirens presumably could sing beautifully. They could use their voices, they could use their music to attract sailors, to lure them, so that they could come very close to the island and they would eventually end up in a shipwreck. That's going to be a tragic ending for the sailors if you are attracted by them. Furies are deities or goddesses of vengeance. These are angry women. They can roar in anger. They get so angry with you, they get so infuriated with you, they will do anything to take revenge against you. So, if you let love happen in the life of a man, love can sometimes work like a siren. Sometimes it can work like a fury. In either case, it's going to be harmful. It's going to be damaging. Now, towards the end of the introduction, Francis Bacon gave us some interesting examples of people who actually allowed themselves to fall in love. The first example is Marcus Antonius. The second example is Appius Claudius. Marcus Antonius is a very famous person, historical figure in the Roman Empire, because he was an important supporter of Julius Caesar. You know this famous Roman Empire figure called Julius Caesar? Yes. He's considered by Francis Bacon as half of the empire because he was so important. He acted as a supporting friend to Julius Caesar, and with his help, the Roman Empire was secured. He was married to a number of women, including Phaedria, Antonia, Fulvia, Octavia, and Cleopatra. And through those relationships, he left behind him a number of children. He obviously loved women. He wanted to have relationships with women. And his end was tragic, because in one of the most important final battles that he lost, he and his lover Cleopatra committed suicide. Now, that was the first example. The famous story of Marcus Antonius came to be dealt with eventually by William Shakespeare in one of the tragedies called Antony and Cleopatra. The story of Appius Claudius, who was one of the most important administrative staff and one of the most important lawgivers in the Roman Empire, was also written about by a contemporary of William Shakespeare called John Webster. John Webster wrote a drama about Appius Claudius and named it Appius and Virginia. Now, these two examples tell us love is a very strong force. For somebody as voluptuous and inordinate like Marcus Antonius, you can be easily conquered by love. For somebody like Appius Claudius, who was probably a wiser man, love can also become a very dangerous force. If you don't keep watch, even if when your heart is fortified, love can find a way into your heart. So love can be extremely powerful. And both of them succumbed to the temptation of love. Now, in the middle of the essay, Francis Bacon told us about what he thought were the problems of falling in love for a man. He said, for example, if you allow yourself to fall in love, you're going to lose your ability to judge things properly. The ability to lose judgment is fatal to a man, according to Francis Bacon. He said, when you fall in love, this passion often gets so excessive that makes you forget nature, makes you forget the value of things. Often when we are in a very stable mental condition, we can judge things properly. But once you are in love, you will disregard the original nature and value of things and start to say very silly things. In the original passage, he said, when you are in love, you see this speaking in the perpetual hyperbole. Perpetual means perennial, permanent. You are forever talking in exaggeration. The person that you love might be a virtuous person, but you tend to exaggerate her virtue so much more that it becomes almost incredible. He said, no proud man on earth would think so absurdly well of himself as the lover does of the person loved. We see in our friends people who are proud. If a person becomes proud, he would often think absurdly well of himself. I become proud because I think I'm good enough. But Francis Bacon said, if you compare a proud man with somebody who has recently fallen in love, this proud man is not a problem. Because this lover is going to say a lot more things, hyperbolic, exaggerating, than otherwise. It's too bad. Because this person has lost the ability to judge, he said. Now, when you are in a loving relationship with another person, he said, this weakness can often be observed by the object of your love. If you are in love with a woman, if that woman loves you back in return, that's okay, because both of you are in love, both of you are confused, and no one knows exactly what's going on. And the man praises the woman, and the woman praises the man. But sometimes we would find a man falling in love with a woman who doesn't reciprocate. When that happens, it's dangerous, because the woman would begin to feel contempt towards you. So that's a big problem about falling in love too. The second problem about falling in love for a man was you are likely to lose riches and wisdom, he said. He cited the famous Greek poet Homer as saying, he that preferred Helena quitted the gifts of Juno and Pallas. The Greek poet Homer made a comment on the same issue. He said, if you fall in love with a woman, you are likely to lose things that are often bestowed upon us by the goddess of marriage and childbirth, for example. Juno was the goddess in Roman mythology of marriage and childbirth. And Pallas, the god of warcraft and victory. According to Homer, If you are hopelessly in love, you are likely to lose an ability to have a good family, a good marriage, lots of healthy children, and you are not going to win any battles if you are in confrontation with anyone. Okay? And Francis Bacon himself also had something to say about this. He said, anyone who thinks too much of amorous affection is likely to lose both riches and wisdom. It's not exactly the same thing as what Homer said, but the argument remains the same. If you fall in love, you're going to lose so much that is worth our keeping. Helena, you probably all know about her, was a famous, beautiful woman in Greek mythology, also known as Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta. Her abduction by a man called Paris brought about the Trojan War. There was a famous war taking place about her. Now, the third problem of a man falling in love has something to do with people tending to lose focus on their life's goals. Francis Bacon said, if you allow love to check once, only once, with your business, it is going to trouble your fortunes and make it impossible to stick to your ends, make it impossible to stay true to your original end, your original ambition, your original aspirations. So those were the three problems. The problem of losing judgment, the problem of losing riches and wisdom, and the problem of losing focus on life's goals. And those were the problems that we have to beware as men of the world. The essay concludes with these statements. Bacon said, there is in man's nature a secret inclination and motion towards love of others, which, if it be not spent on someone or a few, does naturally spread itself towards many and makes men become humane and charitable. That's a great thing about human beings. Human beings seem to have a natural inclination towards love. We don't just love ourselves, we love other people as well. Sometimes our love is bestowed upon an individual or a few people. Sometimes our love goes to many people and it benefits all. He said, a sensible man would do best if he cannot but admit love, would make it keep quarters and sever it wholly from his serious affairs and actions of life. If you are a sensible man, you don't allow yourself to let everything get mixed up. If you can't help but admit love, please keep it at bay, keep it at a distance, and separate the two things. Love is love, business is business. Serious affairs of your life, serious actions of your life are the most important thing. Let them stay apart. Finally, he said, nuptial love makes mankind. Friendly love perfects it, but wanton love corrupts and embases it. The word embase is a more archaic way of saying debases it. If you allow yourself to experience wanton love, you're likely to be corrupted and debased in terms of humanity. Now, having read the essay, we really want to know what the essay intends to communicate to us. So finally, we'd like to look at the message of love. What exactly does Francis Bacon wish to warn us against in this essay? He's clearly issuing some kind of warning. What is it exactly that he wanted to warn us against? Can anyone please think about it and answer my question? Mali, please.
From the essay, we can see that Francis Bacon warns us against wanton love, not love in general. And he says a wanton love, not like nuptial and friendly love, it corrupts and debases human beings. So we human beings should keep love in control and be rational. I think that's what he says in this essay.
Thank you very much. Perfect. Yes, that was good. Well, Francis Bacon tried to warn us against a number of things. He gave negative examples about Marcus Antonius, about Appius Claudius, and all these examples. He wanted to tell us that falling in love is not a problem, but we must be guarded against the voluptuousness and inordinate desires of somebody like Marcus Antonius. We must be also guarded against too much of amorous affection, because it tends to interfere with our serious actions and serious ambitions. And we must also be guarded against wanton love, which is an irresponsible form of love, which is kind of loose relationship. So we must be guarded against all those different kinds of wanton possibilities. Now, when you listen to Francis Bacon telling us about these warnings, we are reminded of a particular point in the middle of the essay, when he referred to a famous philosopher called Epicurus. Somewhere in the middle of the essay, Francis Bacon said, "It is a poor saying of Epicurus, satis magnum alter alteri theatrum sumus." Forgive my Latin. Now, this statement, translated in modern English, actually means each man is to another man certainly a theater large enough. You probably don't understand what he was trying to say. Epicurus wanted to tell us, if you are falling in love with somebody, what you often experience is you feel that this object of your love is so immensely interesting. You don't want to spend a single minute away from him or from her. You want to be with her all the time. She's so interesting. She's so beautiful. She's so kind. She's so good, in a word. She's almost like a theater. She has an endless list of dramas for you to watch. You can spend all your time in this theater and watch the dramas one after one. So each person is likely to become a theater large enough for the person who has recently fallen in love. Now, Francis Bacon doesn't like that. If Epicurus believes that each person can be as interesting as a theater to another, Bacon said, man was not made for the contemplation of small things. We were born for heaven. We were born for noble objects. We should not kneel before a little idol and make ourselves a subject of the mouth or of the eye. We are not beasts. We are human beings. Simply because we are hungry, we don't kneel in front of an idol and pray for food. Simply because we want love, we don't kneel down before a woman for love. That's not what it should be. Human beings are born for higher purposes, for nobler aspirations. According to Francis Bacon, love can do many things in the life of a man. But to sum everything up, he wanted to tell us that love can do mischief. Love can cause problems. Love can bring about tragedies. And love can corrupt us and debases us. Therefore, great men, according to Francis Bacon, should try their best to keep love away, to sever the two experiences, the experience of love and the experience of our serious business and serious affairs and serious actions. When you hear comments like that, you think of a very interesting philosophy which was directly opposed to Epicureanism. We're talking about Epicurus. Epicurus is the philosopher who started a whole tradition of thinking about how to live a life happily. Epicureanism believes that we should enjoy life. We should make good use of the time, the energy that we have in us. Enjoy life while you can. Francis Bacon seemed to believe in Stoicism. He tried to use Stoicism to oppose what Epicurus was trying to preach in his philosophy. Stoicism was a philosophy that cropped up in the 3rd century BC in Hellenistic times, which is another word for Greek times, ancient Greek times. For the Stoics, love is a matter of the head. What does a Stoic wise man do with love? Francis Bacon believes that the Stoic wise man can love people. They can be affectionate to people, but they are affectionate to their families and to their friends. The Stoic wise man they can love people, but they don't love in an irrational way. They try their best to exclude passionate, sexual, and erotic love. If you do that, it's wrong. Stoics believe that you can love, but not irrationally. If you allow yourself to engage in passionate, sexual, and erotic love, you are wrong. Francis Bacon lived in the age of Renaissance, so we automatically make some connection between Francis Bacon and his contemporaries. You all know a drama, famous tragedy, written by William Shakespeare. In Act 2 and Scene 2 of Hamlet, the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, William Shakespeare had his protagonist say this: "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action how like an angel, in apprehension how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals." This is a celebration of mankind. Hamlet was very pessimistic in his own story, in his own drama, but somehow even he realized that human beings can be a very great species. Human beings are very special on earth. They can be like God at times. So Francis Bacon probably shared some of the things that Hamlet was talking about in terms of humanity. He probably shared much of the thinkings about human mankind as William Shakespeare was doing in the same period of time. Francis Bacon was a Renaissance man after all. As a Renaissance man, Bacon was like Shakespeare. He showed us his absolute faith in man's capacity to achieve greatness and perfection. Although he told us at the same time that all that was needed to fulfill the potential of human mankind was the effort plus proper methodology. The one impediment for great men, if they wish to achieve something, was to him wanton love and nothing else. I've got a final question for people in this classroom. How much do you know about Francis Bacon's own experience of love? I have deliberately left out that part of Francis Bacon's life, and I suppose people are getting really curious. They really want to know. Does anyone know something about Francis Bacon's own experience of love and marriage and things like that?
Yes, I heard something about it. Bacon fell in love with a woman who was in his mid-30s. The woman was a young widow named Elizabeth Hatton. However, she broke off their relationship and married a man who was materially affluent. Years later, Bacon still wrote of regret that the marriage to her had not taken place.
Okay, that's good. That's good. You've obviously read about Francis Bacon and his life. Now, indeed, Francis Bacon was a great man. He didn't worry about love. He didn't worry about marrying a woman in the early parts of his life. He lived something like 65 years in his life, but he didn't start to consider possibilities of marriage until he was in his mid-30s. When he was 36, he started to court a woman by the name of Elizabeth Hatton. Yes, that was the woman that you mentioned. That woman was only 20. She was a widow of 20. But the relationship didn't work out because she soon married somebody economically better off. At the age of 45, Francis Bacon married another woman, Alice Barnum, who was only about 14 years old. She was a daughter of a well-connected London alderman and member of parliament. Generally, this marriage with Alice Barnum was one of much conjugal love and respect. Or so the story went. Some people believe that they had a reasonably good relationship until later things started to happen. One of the big problems with Francis Bacon during his lifetime was he constantly fell into debts. So when the financial conditions went bad, Alice Barnum decided to go out and seek assistance from the family's friends. But in the process, she fell in love with a man, and she started to develop a secret romantic relationship with a man called John Underhill. Guess how Bacon reacted to it? Francis Bacon was so disappointed, so infuriated by this, that he decided to rewrite his will, in which he revoked all that he had previously promised to give her, including lands, goods, and income, and everything. So it was a disappointment to Francis Bacon. Was probably Francis Bacon too disappointed by women that he decided to write an essay like this? My answer is no. I wouldn't say so. For I prefer to think perhaps Francis Bacon saw himself as a man of his time, who needed the concentration and focus to achieve something. If one considered himself as a great man, according to Francis Bacon, he simply wouldn't want to be distracted or lured away by this weak passion that we call love. That brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much.